Hello, and welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. Each episode, we talk about a particular topic in the life of a professor. We are tenure-track faculty members in the sciences, working at a primarily undergraduate university in California. The purpose of our podcast is reflection, so we bring something we think is working and something we're working on to discuss. Hey, before the episode starts, I wanted to give you a heads up that we have merch. We have Professor Podcast mugs with our logo on them, so you can drink tea with us with a Professor Podcast mug if you so desire. We have links for buying them in the show notes. And now on to the episode. Welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. I'm Claire, and today I'm delighted to talk with my colleague and friend, Professor C.D. Hoyle. Welcome to the show, C.D.
Thanks, Claire. Great to be here. Yeah, I'm excited.
Awesome. Me too. So I consider C.D. to be both a friend and a mentor. I ask him things about getting tenure and how sabbaticals work and that kind of thing. But today, we're going to be talking about his success and tips in securing funding and making progress doing research with undergraduates, which I'm super excited about. Yeah. So, C.D., would you start off by giving us a bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I don't know how far you want to go back, but I went to undergraduate at a big school, University of Colorado Boulder, so a little bit different than here in Humboldt. Mm-hmm. And then did my PhD in Seattle. I did a couple postdocs and tried some teaching while I was postdocing, and then decided that's kind of what I wanted to focus on, and then was lucky enough to get this job here at Humboldt. And that was
Awesome.
That was in 2007 I started. So I've been here about almost 15 years.
Sweet.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about was your NSF funding. So you've been funded by NSF pretty much continuously, at least as far as I could look back on NSF award search, at least a decade or so.
Yeah, since 2011, I think, was our first successful award. So I had a little bit of Research Corporation funding before that, from 2008 to 2010. And then applied once for NSF funding and got denied, but the program officer gave me some tips to reapply, which I did. Sweet. And then they kind of gave me a shortened award at first, like a 2-year trial kind of thing. And then, yeah, since then we've been getting extensions for continuous funding since 2011. Yeah, it's been really great.
That's awesome. And so how have you been able to keep it going that long? What have you been doing? What did you do in those first 2 years to make it happen, and how has it been going since then?
So, I do experimental physics, a lot of hardware focused stuff, and that takes a long time. And so to develop, especially these kind of precision type experiments that we're doing, there's a lot of stuff you have to build and develop for this experiment that you just can't buy. You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah.
And so the first couple of years were mostly kind of just hardware focused, like getting stuff set up, and then getting some software written for data acquisition and things like that. And so
that makes sense.
In the first couple of years, there was no real expectation that we would have final results or anything. And so when it came time to renew, that wasn't such a big deal, I guess. We were like, well, we're making some progress. And so I think the lengthy nature of experimental physics is kind of helped to keep us going. And also, we're not a super expensive program in terms of NSF, by NSF standards. There's been part of our grant is a collaboration with the University of Washington. And so we send a student up there every summer to work with that bigger gravitational physics group. And so that collaboration has kind of helped us keep the funding going too. I think it helps, build confidence, this kind of bigger program still wants to keep collaborating with us.
That makes sense.
And I guess just kind of continual incremental progress. I think we had to kind of help the NSF and the program reviewer and the reviewers understand kind of the situation of how big our teaching loads are and things like that. And you do, if you apply through the RUI, Research at Undergraduate Institutions channel in the NSF, you get to add this extra 5-page RUI impact statement where you get to explain like why your research might not proceed at the pace of an R1 institution and you know what other limitations you have on campus and things like that. So I think definitely doing that, applying through those channels. The other thing I'll say is that I try to emphasize in the proposals and the project reports just how we're developing like human resources and students to go on to graduate school and careers and things like that, and then showing them in these things, kind of like emphasizing the success of the students after their undergraduate program.
That makes sense. So the experience the undergraduates get as part of being in this project is one of the main impacts of the project, in addition to all the science as well.
Right. You know, NSF has like intellectual merit and broader impacts. And I'd say that the broader impacts is probably where we are doing a bit better in some sense. I mean, we have been kind of, you know, the experiment kind of progresses along, but it's a long, even at an R1 institution, kind of the work like ours will take years to come to any kind of result. So
just the nature of the project,
right?
Build stuff, and then that makes sense. So what about your narrative of your proposal? I'm interested. One of the things I find has been helpful when I've been writing proposals is kind of having a really clear story. Like, this is the topic we're targeting, and we're going to go after it in these 3 different ways. What do you kind of think about when you're structuring your proposal and how to make it clear for the reviewers?
Yeah, I try to. Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely try to not make it too broad, I guess.
Okay.
I try to kind of focus on, I think if you try to claim you're going to accomplish a million things and then you don't accomplish them, it sometimes is, you know, that doesn't look so great. So I'm just going to try to be like, well, we're going to do this and this and this. And, but I think, having been a proposal reviewer as well, I just honestly think like clear and well-formatted writing and is key to kind of just readability in some ways is what it comes down to, and not making it overly technical, but you can refer to other references and things like that for if people want to dig a little bit deeper. But,
that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So readability. And do you work a lot with your like pre-award specialist at sponsored programs to do that, or do you kind of have a system for it yourself now?
So back when we were starting, like in my first NSF award, the pre-award office didn't really exist in its form.
Oh, okay.
And so it was a lot of work on my part. And then a lot of the subsequent proposals were kind of updates to that first one, kind of adding in our accomplishments and new students and what they had done, and maybe, you know, if new kind of theoretical papers come out, kind of ways that our experiment might address those. But there's not like a huge change from one proposal cycle to the next, I guess.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Cool. That's nice. You've got that old proposal to kind of build on as you continue to renew it. That's a good system.
I have to say the time commitment for writing the proposal and these continuation proposals gets smaller every time.
Sure.
Yeah, which is kind of nice as well.
That is nice.
Yeah.
That's a good system.
Yeah.
So let's talk about working with the undergraduate students, and particularly in our departments where we don't have any graduate students. And so one of the things that I've kind of had a challenge with is that the undergraduates are only around for a short period and, you know, just working a few hours a week. So they get all trained and productive and then they graduate. So I wonder what your approach is with this. How do you get significant research done when they're only around for such a short time?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, I do try to get them early in their undergraduate, in their undergraduate careers. Mm-hmm. Maybe when they're like, sophomores or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not always as concerned with I know that some faculty members are really concerned with what courses students have taken before they do research, and that definitely makes sense in some contexts. For our lab, I'm not as concerned with that. I'm just really, if they're enthusiastic and they've had a little bit of introductory physics, we can generally work with that. Because there's a wide variety of kinds of things they could do in the lab, from machining parts to writing software or whatever. So I try to get them pretty early on, so that then a lot of them I have stick around for 2 or more years. And in that sense, you can almost treat them like a graduate student in some ways. And I do think a lot of them actually respond to that kind of responsibility pretty well. You know what I mean? They like that. They like having that kind of responsibility, I guess.
That's really cool. I like that. So you grab them early. Don't worry as much about what classes they've taken, but more about that they're interested in doing it.
Yeah, more about they're interested and that they're willing to learn and kind of, learn by doing and get in the lab and get their hands on stuff. Well, when we used to be able to do that before the pandemic. So.
Yeah, back when we could go in the lab.
I mean, as much more than we can now.
Yeah. And so that's really interesting. So I really like that. And what about expectations? How do you what kind of expectations do you communicate with them when they're starting in your group and they're new?
Yeah, so I typically do give them a trial period of 1 semester where they can sign up for a unit of Physics 495, which is our undergraduate research unit. And, during that time, and my typical expectation is if they've signed up for a unit of that class, that they'll kind of work in the lab 3 hours a week or something like that, or more. And that could include group meetings or even doing background reading. So for that first semester, I feel like they're kind of just getting up to speed. And, getting really up to speed can even take longer. But, we can see how that first semester goes. And they can kind of shadow some of the students who've been around for a longer time. And maybe help out with kind of those projects that are ongoing from the older students.
Yeah.
And then I do try to have the older students mentor the new students, to kind of transfer this knowledge from one class to the next,
Totally.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And that seems like that would also help with this they're not around that long kind of thing, where you're passing the knowledge on from one to the next, really.
Exactly.
Like that.
Exactly.
That's really cool. Go ahead.
And it works most of the time. It's not always perfect system.
Of course. Yeah.
For some students, it doesn't work out. And some older students realize they're maybe not such great mentors and, things that happen.
Sure.
Like that. So.
Yeah. So that kind of transitions into another thing I wanted to ask you about, was how you schedule your students. So kind of what I do at the beginning of the semester is I get my research students' availability, and I come up with this weekly schedule of when everyone's going to be in the lab, and I like that because nobody's going to forget about research that week, them or me. We know when they're going to be in the lab, and I have to make sure they have whatever they need and all that. But on the other hand, sometimes research takes longer one week than another, or there's this project that's actually going to take, so sometimes it doesn't fit neatly into little 3-hour chunks. So what's your system with scheduling, and how do you have regular scheduled time, or what do you do?
So I'd say I'm pretty much the opposite of that.
Oh, interesting. Okay, cool.
Which I think I could benefit a lot from doing more scheduling for sure. But the way I've been doing it is I definitely get their schedules. We do a little poll, and we'll definitely have a 1 hour a week group meeting. Okay. When everybody can make it, and those have, obviously we're in person, and now they're on Zoom. And we all meet, and we kind of summarize what has happened during the last week and what we plan to do during the next week. And what I've tried to do off and on, and goes into some of the things that I'm working on, is to try to have myself or one of the students give a 5-minute little presentation during our group meetings, 5 to 10 minutes, about anything really that they've been working on or questions that have come up for them about what's happening in the lab. So anyway, the group meetings last about an hour, and then I'll have a breakout meeting or two with them, smaller groups of students during the week, but we don't really set a schedule time to be in the lab. Also, my lab's very small, so I don't know. We only have like 4 or 5 students working for me at any one time. And so, yeah, it's more of kind of an accomplishment-based thing rather than a scheduled thing, I guess.
Okay,
and
that's cool.
I do ask them to kind of, as I say, put in 3 hours a week. So I can kind of, it's more of an informal, like, what did you do this week kind of thing, or what do you plan to do? Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, so at the group meeting, somebody presents out for 5 or 10 minutes, but do you touch base with everybody?
Yeah, like one person will present what they're doing, and usually students work in maybe a pair, or, and so, but one student will kind of present what they've been doing and what problems they've run into or something like that. But yeah, we'll definitely touch base with everybody during that time. And, and for the newer students, it's more just kind of like a chance to see what's happening and what they might be interested in working on, I guess. So,
totally. That makes a lot of sense.
But we definitely have a one hour scheduled per week, and then from there it's a little more loose. Yeah.
Like as needed, or
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in the summer is different, of course, but yeah.
Yeah. So summer you'd more have people in the lab for bigger chunks of time, and
and at least in years past, for sure.
Right.
So strange.
Non-pandemic years.
But summer, I've been lucky to have enough funding to kind of support 2 full-time students in the lab, and then I pay them, for their time in the lab. So that's more of a 30, 40 hour a week kind of thing for them in the summer.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And that's such a good time for them to get trained up and be super competent.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is nice.
Exactly. So we'll see if the funding keeps going. That's always the issue, right?
That's always the question. Yeah. So is your lab more productive in the summer, would you say, in terms of what you accomplish? Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Not this summer, but
right.
Even last summer during the pandemic, we were pretty productive. This summer, for example, most of my research students got REUs.
Cool.
NSF, research internships at other universities, and so a lot of them went. I'd encourage them to do that too, to get a broader array of experiences.
Sure.
And so
yeah.
So this summer was a little bit limited in the amount of time people had, but generally speaking, the summer is when I'm there several days a week, and the students are there 30 to 40 hours a week, and we're really trying to get things accomplished. Yeah,
that makes sense.
So during the semester is obviously kind of 1 hour a week meetings, and then hopefully 3 hours a week, of them working on stuff. So
yeah, totally. So this is kind of a specific question that came up to me while I was thinking about this, which is, are there any parts of your work that you don't have the undergrads do? Either because it's like too easy to break, or there's too much training required before they get to that aspect. Lately, a few things have come up like that for me in my research lab, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about it, but I like keeping them mine, but I wonder if I should try to figure out how to give them to the undergraduates too. Yeah,
that's a good question. There are definitely pieces of equipment that I'm less comfortable having them use. So like we have these delicate kind of fibers that we use in the experiment, and so I tend to handle those. Although then I did have a student learn to fabricate them. So
cool.
So I guess when I can, I try to keep the important, keep the breakable stuff kind of under my supervision, but maybe have like a parallel track of maybe a test bed where the students can kind of learn to work with these things as well. Totally. And I mean, there's definitely things like, the proposal writing. I don't have them help me with that at all or anything like that. But in the lab, I'd say as long as I've kind of checked them out on most things, and that takes some time sometimes, then it's usually okay. But
yeah, I kind of feel like there's these things that I want to keep extra care with, but if they've worked up slowly to the point where they are going to be okay using it, then that's awesome.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to approach it, and they definitely break things. I mean, not major pieces of equipment, but I think that's part of the learning process too. And,
yes.
They get super upset about it, but it's not the end of the world. So yeah.
I always like to tell my students of this. Usually, yeah. I like to tell my students of this one day in graduate school where I broke a pH meter and made an acid fountain that hit the ceiling on the same day, and had to tell the technician about both those things at the same time. But now I remember both those things.
Yeah, I definitely broke some expensive things in graduate school. My advisor was not always happy. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. But so
yeah. So let's see. I guess I just wanted to ask your thoughts. We're both at this primarily undergraduate institution and excited about doing research with undergraduates, but what would you say is the reason to pursue NSF grants at a primarily undergraduate university where we're actually focused on teaching?
Well,
Why do you do it?
I think teaching through research, is one of these kind of invaluable experiences that the students can have. And, they can go to internships off campus and things like that, but having them able to stay here during the summer, it also keeps the students interested in being here at our university and more engaged. And then also, let's see. Sorry, lost my train of thought.
No, I agree completely. And I really think the students are extra excited to be involved in a big project funded by this national organization. This is something big that they're working on, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad both to do the research and to give them that opportunity to be involved in it.
And sometimes they get emails, from NSF just with requesting things like demographic information or whatever, but they're excited to answer those, and they'll send me an email being like, "Oh, I got this email from the NSF,"
Totally.
And so,
every time you submit your annual reports, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Totally. And it's I think it's important for kind of, also inspiring other faculty members to pursue these things and kind of just develop a broader kind of research kind of element to our campus. But I do think for the students, they're going to end up doing research or technical work, and this kind of experience is super important for them. In addition to the classroom. And one thing I like, I guess for the kind of work I do, there's a lot of things from our undergraduate curriculum that they can translate into the lab and back and forth. A lot of kind of these even just kind of introductory or junior level physics concepts that show up in our lab, like mechanics and basic circuits and things like that. So that we actually end up working with. So it's kind of cool to see that kind of interplay between the lab and the classroom. And then we have a capstone course where students present, a talk on something they've kind of independently investigated. And a lot of the students who work in my lab will end up, doing that talk on some project they've worked on in the lab.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So that's kind of cool. So having these grants is, aside from the money, I think it's just a really, really great kind of experience. It provides a lot of great experiences that students maybe wouldn't otherwise get. And one of the other ways I keep them kind of interested in sticking with research is the allure of travel, because going to conferences and a lot of students maybe haven't been many places at their age, and so we get to go to Columbus, Ohio, which is cool.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just a new place for a lot of the students, or wherever. Going to national and regional conferences, which the NSF makes possible through these grants, is really cool as well. And then they usually do present at these conferences, so that's another skill that that is definitely useful to develop.
Yeah, I remember as an undergrad doing all this travel through research, and I was like, wow, maybe this is the right field. You know, this is cool, all this traveling. So, totally. And what an experience to present at a national meeting. That's awesome. Yeah,
and so we try to go every year, and even during the pandemic, we've been doing the virtual meetings. But we've tried to go to the American Physical Society meetings, the regional and national ones. So that's always great. Mm-hmm.
Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you, which kind of ties back to the normal format of the podcast, is what aspects of your undergraduate research you're working on right now? What do you want to improve with your research group dynamic?
Yeah. And there's always, of course, things, right?
Always, of course.
I think right now, and I think the remote nature of work lately has been kind of inspiring me to kind of help the students work on a few things, which is one of them is logging of their lab work.
Oh.
And, we used to have a hard copy of the lab book in the lab, and now we can't do that. And even before the pandemic, it's always been a challenge to get them to log stuff in the lab book or online. We have a Google, Doc or whatever going. So I think really trying to get them to be better documenters of what they're doing is...
That makes sense.
It's always a challenge, and I have to admit that I'm not always the best either. And so it's kind of a work in progress for myself as well.
Totally.
So keeping better records of lab work. A lot of times it's just like, oh, I stopped this run and started another, but even just having that in the logbook and, what...
Yeah.
is important.
Yeah. I'm always amazed when I look back at all the notes I thought I was meticulously taking while we did some experiment, and what huge thing I left out at the time.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah.
And so that's one thing. Another one, I have a couple more. And I think I've been trying to emphasize the importance of actually finishing a project.
Oh, I
love it. Because our experiment spans years, it's kind of easy to get lost in the kind of like, oh, I'm just kind of making incremental progress all the time. But I really am trying to, relay the fact that actually finishing something to a point where you can say this is done is important. And again, I'm guilty of these things, of not doing these things as well. But and along with that, I think related to that is that we've been talking with my group recently about starting to write short publishable articles that focus on like pieces of the work rather than a big overall paper, which obviously takes a long time and years of data and stuff like that. And so there's a few journals out there that will accept, I think, like short little, kind of project reports or project updates.
Oh, that's cool.
Or I guess maybe just like we'll accept kind of pieces of work. You know what I mean? Like, for example, a couple of my students are developing the system to keep our apparatus level because our old building wobbles around during the course of the day a lot.
Sure.
Well, not a lot, but enough that it matters for us.
Yeah.
And just that control system of keeping the apparatus level would be something that maybe they could write up and submit to a journal, even though it's not, new physics or anything like that. It's something that they've accomplished. So
that's awesome. Do you have examples of what kind of journals those would be?
So there's the name escapes me right now, but there's something like the, because it just restarted under a new name. There's a Journal of Undergraduate Research in Physics, I believe.
Okay.
Or, I'd have to look.
We can look it up.
I'd have to look it up again.
Yeah.
And then actually something I didn't mention, but the National Conference on Undergraduate Research, which is held every year. If you go to that, the students can get a publication out of that as well.
Cool.
And I did that for a number of years, and then later we just started going to NSF meetings, APS meetings, because it was more of professional society meetings, which I felt like they would meet more people who they might be able to network with. Actually, professional societies is another. I kind of make all my students join the APS because
Interesting.
Well, it's free for the first year, and then they get the Physics Today, and they get some access to scholarships and things like that.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, but yeah, there's a couple journals out there like the NCUR Journal and this Journal of Undergraduate Research in Physics, and there is just the Journal of Undergraduate Research published by Colorado State, I believe, and we did publish a paper in there as well. So
cool.
And then there's there's other kind of ones like that. I have to think about. Their names slip me right now.
That's really interesting because, I know what you mean. Like, I had a student last semester who did a project that got to the completion of his project, but that's just a piece of a bigger project, so it's not ready to publish yet. But he finished his piece, and it's an awesome piece, and it would be really cool if we could publish that piece and then just later refer to it in part of the bigger thing.
Yeah.
So I hadn't thought of these kind of journals for that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, important for getting our funding continued, because one of the kind of criticisms that I've gotten in the last cycle was, you aren't publishing enough. And so I'm hoping that maybe these short kind of snippets of our progress might help out with that in that regard.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm
also trying to keep our community going in the lab, kind of keep building our community.
Ooh.
That's kind of an ongoing project as well. So during the pandemic, I've been using things like Slack. We have like a Slack group for our lab, and that's actually been, much more useful than email, I think.
Totally.
And so...
so you have different channels for different projects? Or...
Well, different channels for different projects. Yeah, exactly. Or like, a channel for conferences and presentations where people can upload, hey, maybe I want to present this thing or whatever. So I've been trying to keep...
I like that.
Yeah, I've been trying to keep up with that. And then, and the pandemic has presented a great time to develop more software skills for us as students. So I've been trying to focus on, kind of indicating, I've been trying to get them to realize that software, whether you like it or not, is probably going to be a large part of your physics career if you stay in research. And so I'm
telling my students the same thing about data.
Yeah, I never liked writing software that much, but I learned to do it, and along the way, and so part of what I'm telling them is it's probably useful to actually take a course or two in software. So I don't know.
That's great. That's really cool.
And then I have a couple other collaborations, in one in Indiana and one in Italy. And trying to kind of build on those, keep those collaborations alive and strengthen them as well is something that I'm kind of working on as well. So,
And what are you doing to keep those alive and strengthen them, since you can't go there or exchange students right now?
Well, I do have students who are working remotely with the Indiana group.
Okay.
And so just trying to keep them involved in, software or analysis projects that they can do remotely. Typically, I would send one student to Indiana for the summer, one student to Seattle. And so just trying to keep them involved a little bit as remotely as much as possible. And then the Italy collaboration is kind of a whole different kind of emerging thing. So just trying to kind of figure out where that's going, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I love that system you have of having the collaborators at the R1 universities, and your students can go there, and that seems like it benefits everybody. That's a really cool setup.
Yeah, and I think it was actually key for us initially getting funding, and maybe for keeping the funding going was to have, as maybe I mentioned before, but it's having this kind of, these other more developed research groups kind of validating what we're doing, I guess.
Totally.
So
I'm also inspired by your Slack channel I have a Slack channel for my lab group, but I haven't updated it in years.
Yeah, and
maybe I should boost that up again.
During the semester, it was going really well, and then when the summer hit and the students scattered to their internships, the chatter has become a little quieter. But hopefully, once the semester starts next week.
Next week?
Is it, or something? Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe hopefully it'll pick back up, because I do have a few students still registered for research this fall. So
yeah. This is maybe I'll start mine up too.
Yeah.
That sounds exciting. Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast, CD. It's been really helpful talking with you.
Thanks for having me here, and it's been great for me to think about these things too a little bit. Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. Would you like to hear more episodes with CD? Let us know. Email us at contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. As you may know, Ruth is on leave of absence, and in the meantime, Ralph and I are exploring other approaches to the podcast. We'd love your feedback.